10 highly trained climbers walked into Mount Challenger in October 2013 and never came back down. That opening sentence doesn't fully capture it, though. These weren't amateur hikers who got lost on a casual weekend trip. These were elite mountaineers, people who had summited Everest, tackled K2, pushed the limits of what human beings could endure on the world's most dangerous peaks. The Apex Climbing Expedition was assembled from the absolute best in the field, people with decades of combined experience, satellite phones, GPS units, and emergency protocols that would make most rescue teams jealous. They called themselves Apex because they were the top of their field. Every single member had an impeccable safety record. Every member had completed training that would break most people. They weren't thrill seekers or social media climbers taking selfies at base camp. These were professionals who treated mountaineering like a science and an art form combined. The expedition was organized by Robert Chen, a legendary expedition leader who had personally guided 47 successful summits of peaks over 25,000 feet. Chen had a philosophy that he'd repeated in interviews for 2 decades. Mountaineering isn't about conquering the mountain. It's about respecting it, understanding it, knowing your place within it. He said the moment you stopped being humble was the moment the mountain stopped being forgiving. With him were specialists in every conceivable role. There was Maria Delgado, a high-altitude medicine expert who'd worked on Denali, the Andes, and the Himalayas. There was James Whitmore, a climbing cinematographer who documented expeditions for major networks. Sarah Kim was an environmental scientist studying glacier patterns at extreme elevations. Dr. Henrik Larsson was a Swedish physiologist researching how human bodies adapted to low-oxygen environments. David Okafor, a logistics coordinator from Nigeria, had orchestrated supply chains for 5 different Himalayan expeditions. Then there were the pure climbers, athletes like Marcus Webb and Yuki Tanaka, both of whom had speed records on multiple peaks. Veteran climber Patricia Moreno, who at 56 was the oldest member and had more years of mountaineering experience than most people had years of life. Young Alex Turner, just 28, but with credentials that rivaled people twice his age. And finally, financial consultant Thomas Bradley, who wasn't a climber by profession, but was obsessed with mountaineering and had trained for 3 years specifically for this expedition. Mount Challenger wasn't the tallest peak they had faced. It was 19,400 feet, significant, but not extreme by the standards of this group. The climb was planned for early October, a window when the weather patterns were most favorable. They had a 45-day expedition planned, with multiple base camps, careful acclimatization schedules, and more backup plans than most military operations. The team departed on October 2nd. They filed their route plans with the local authorities. They had check-in protocols scheduled for every 3 days with base camp management. They had satellite phones, personal locator beacons, GPS devices that would transmit their location automatically. If something went wrong, help would be on the way within hours. By October 8th, they should have reached Camp 2. The check-in call never came. By October 10th, rescuers were mobilizing. By October 12th, the first rescue team was on the mountain. What they found was the first sign that something wasn't just wrong, something was impossibly wrong. The lower camps were intact, supplies were stocked. There were no signs of avalanche, no signs of rockfall, no signs of the kind of catastrophic natural event that could wipe out an entire expedition. It was like the team had simply decided to vanish and walked into the clouds. But here's what made the authorities truly concerned. What made the rescue operation escalate into something much bigger. The team's GPS coordinates showed they had deliberately turned around. The data showed them moving away from Mount Challenger entirely, heading toward a region that made no sense given their route. They weren't lost. They weren't caught in a whiteout that disoriented them. They actively, consciously changed direction, and then the signal stopped entirely. What followed was the largest rescue and recovery operation ever mounted for missing mountaineers. The government mobilized every resource they could find. Helicopters swept across the region, search teams on foot combed through ravines and valleys. They brought in volunteers, local guides, military personnel trained in mountain rescue. They spent millions of dollars and deployed hundreds of personnel. The families waited. Robert Chen's wife, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, gave interviews where she remained composed but clearly struggling. She talked about how careful Robert was, how he never took unnecessary risks, how he treated every expedition like it was his first one. In one interview, tears streamed down her face as she said, "Robert always came home. He's always come home." The implied but never spoken follow-up hung in the air. Until now. The search dragged on. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The weather grew worse. Snow fell deeper. The mountain became actively hostile to rescue efforts. By December, official search operations were scaled back, not because they'd given up, but because continuing to search in those conditions meant risking the lives of more people. The case went cold. The families never stopped hoping. Social media campaigns kept the story alive. Friends of the expedition organized their own search efforts during better weather windows. Documentary filmmakers started developing stories about the disappearance. Online communities speculated endlessly about what might have happened. Some people suggested avalanche in a location rescue teams hadn't reached yet. Others proposed altitude sickness that caused irrational behavior. A small but vocal group online suggested something more sinister, that the climbers had encountered something on the mountain, something that warranted all 10 of them being completely silent about it. That theory sounded ridiculous to most people, but it would become the only theory that actually fit the evidence. 17 months passed, 17 months of not knowing, 17 months where the families lived in a state of limbo, unable to fully grieve because there was no body, no closure, just endless empty space where certainty should have been. Then, in March 2015, a park ranger named David Morrison was doing routine patrol work in a region about 4 miles from the climbers' planned route. He wasn't looking for them anymore. Nobody was, but he saw something that made him stop, a flash of color caught in the rocks that shouldn't have been there. It was fabric, weathered, torn, but unmistakably from a high-quality climbing tent. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone who had been following the case. Suddenly, the story was front-page news again. Suddenly, after 17 months of nothing, there was something. Evidence, physical proof that something had happened to them in that specific location. What investigators found when they carefully excavated the site was a scene that didn't make immediate sense. The tent was a 4-person shelter, the kind designed for extreme conditions. It was torn in ways that suggested violent activity. The fabric had weathered 17 months of exposure to wind, snow, and sun, but the damage pattern didn't match that kind of wear. Some of the tears looked fresh by comparison, deliberate, as if someone had ripped the tent open forcefully. Inside the tent, they found sleeping bags, some personal gear, and scattered equipment, but they also found something that made forensic investigators exchange looks that communicated deep concern. Bloodstains on the interior fabric. Human blood. A lot of it. They found a GPS device, its battery long dead but its internal memory intact. When they powered it up with fresh batteries, the location history told a story that was disturbing and confusing in equal measure. The device showed the team reaching their planned Camp 2 location without issue, but then the coordinates showed them deviating dramatically from their route. The GPS tracks showed them moving in a direction that made no mountaineering sense. They were heading toward lower elevation in a region that wasn't part of their planned climb. The deviation wasn't gradual. It was immediate. Sharp turn, then straight line toward a location that would mean abandoning the expedition entirely. Investigators collected everything from the site and brought it back for forensic analysis. The tent was photographed extensively. The blood samples were tested for DNA. The GPS device was subjected to complete technical analysis. The personal gear was cataloged and examined. That's when the official investigation took a turn that most people didn't expect. Inside the tent, buried under some of the scattered equipment, investigators found a journal. It was partially water-damaged, but still mostly readable. The handwriting belonged to Robert Chen. Investigators confirmed this through comparison with his known handwriting from letters and documents. The entries were dated, and they started from the beginning of the expedition. The early entries were exactly what you'd expect from an experienced climber. Notes about the team's condition, comments about the weather, observations about geological formations, standard expedition journaling. But starting on October 6th, 2 entries in, the tone shifted. The entries became shorter, more guarded. In one entry, Robert wrote, "The team is confused about changes in our route. I told them a localized storm system made the original path unsafe, but the weather has cleared. I can't tell them the real reason. I can't explain it in writing. Radio silence is absolute. Radio silence." Those 2 words flagged every alarm system in the investigation. Climbers maintained radio contact with base camp. That was basic protocol. That was survival. Why would Robert Chen, a man who had never deviated from safety protocols in his entire career, suddenly institute radio silence? The next entry was dated 3 days later, October 9th. The handwriting was shakier, less controlled. "Things escalated today. We saw the fence. I didn't think it existed. I didn't think they could be here. We have to assume they saw us. The team is frightened. I've told them to remain calm, to maintain discipline. 3 of them are advocating for descending immediately and contacting authorities. I'm overruling them for now. If we can get distance from this location, if we can put enough geography between us and what we discovered, we might be safe. I might be able to explain this in a way that doesn't result in all of us disappearing." A fence. In the middle of a remote mountainous region, during a climbing expedition to a peak that had no known military installations, Robert Chen found a fence. The last entry was dated October 12th. It was the shortest entry in the journal, and it was written in what forensic investigators described as a distressed or rushed style. "They found us. 2 hours, maybe less. I've told the team to scatter, take the emergency supplies, try to reach base camp separately. If we disperse, maybe not all of them will be caught. This is my fault. This is all my fault." That was the last thing Robert Chen would ever write. When the contents of the journal became known to authorities, the investigation fundamentally changed. This wasn't a search and rescue operation anymore. This was a criminal investigation. Investigators began analyzing the GPS data with new urgency. They mapped out exactly where the team had deviated from their route, and they started researching what might be located in that region. They filed Freedom of Information requests, they contacted government agencies, they asked questions about military installations, research facilities, classified operations. Most of the doors they knocked on either didn't open, or opened just enough to confirm the government had no comment. But one avenue of investigation bore fruit. A forensic analysis of the tent itself revealed something unexpected. Military-grade camouflage fibers embedded in the fabric where the tent had been damaged, not civilian camouflage clothing, which has a different molecular structure and weave pattern. Military camouflage, the specific type used by special operations units. When investigators examined the bloodstains more carefully, they found more than one blood type. At minimum, 4 different DNA profiles were present on the tent's interior. Some of that blood matched samples from expedition members that investigators obtained from the families. Some didn't match anyone in their system. The physical evidence was painting a picture that sounded impossible, but was becoming harder to deny. The climbing team had encountered military personnel or security operatives at that location. There had been conflict, there had been violence, and then the climbers had disappeared. Investigators began interviewing local villagers and park staff who had any knowledge of the region. In a nearby settlement, an older man named Tenzin described seeing unusual activity in the region earlier that year. Armed vehicles, personnel moving in groups wearing military-style uniforms. He said it had seemed unusual because that area wasn't known for military operations. "They acted like they owned the mountain," Tenzin said in his interview, "like the mountain was theirs, not the government's." The investigation turned toward private security contractors. Several companies operated in the region, providing security services for various government and private entities. The largest and most secretive was called Blackstone Security Solutions. Blackstone operated with high-level government contracts. They provided security services for sensitive installations and research facilities. They had a reputation for being professional, discreet, and extremely effective. They also had a reputation for operating in gray areas. Whenever Blackstone was mentioned in law enforcement circles, people tended to lower their voices and acknowledge that getting information about Blackstone operations was nearly impossible. Investigators started piecing together information from open sources. News reports from the relevant region in the months prior to the expedition mentioned rumors of increased military activity in the area. There were unconfirmed reports of new construction projects in remote locations. Satellite imagery from public databases showed what appeared to be new vehicle tracks in regions where civilian activity should have been minimal. Then, investigators got a break. A whistleblower came forward, someone with direct knowledge of Blackstone operations in that specific region during the relevant time frame. The whistleblower was anonymous, communicating through secure channels with investigative journalists. According to this source, Blackstone had been running a covert surveillance and research operation in that region for several years. The operation was classified. It wasn't officially acknowledged by any government agency. And it was running in an area that technically civilians could access, specifically the climbing routes that led toward Mount Challenger. According to the whistleblower, Blackstone had strict orders to maintain the secrecy of the operation. That meant controlling access to the region. It meant intercepting anyone who stumbled upon the facility, and it meant ensuring that no information about the operation leaked to the outside world. They were extremely thorough, the whistleblower said in recorded conversations with investigative journalists. If someone accidentally discovered the facility, protocols were in place. Those protocols ensured that discovery didn't become a problem. The language was carefully chosen, euphemistic, but the implication was clear. If someone found something they weren't supposed to find, there were procedures to handle that situation. And those procedures apparently didn't involve letting those people leave and report to authorities. Investigators with the authority to do so, military intelligence agencies and federal law enforcement, began working on classified cases related to Blackstone's operations. What they discovered was documented in reports that most civilians still cannot access today. According to those reports, there was indeed an underground facility in the region where the climbers had deviated. The facility was sophisticated, well-funded, and involved experimental technology research. The exact nature of the research remains classified, but evidence suggests it involved advanced surveillance systems and signal processing technology with military applications. The facility employed about 40 permanent personnel, with additional contractors rotating in and out on short-term assignments. It was staffed by both military personnel and private contractors. Everyone working there had high-level security clearances. Everyone knew that maintaining operational security was absolutely critical. The facility had perimeter monitoring systems, cameras, motion sensors, and personnel patrols kept watch over the surrounding area. When the Apex climbing expedition passed too close to the facility, when their climbing route brought them toward the classified area, the monitoring systems detected them. Initial contact was made by Blackstone personnel. According to witness statements and internal communications later recovered by investigators, the Blackstone team attempted to redirect the climbers away from the facility. The climbers were told that the area was closed due to geological hazards. They were advised to take an alternate route for safety reasons. Robert Chen's account in his journal suggests he understood the lie immediately. He recognized that the reasoning didn't match the region's actual geology. More importantly, he saw the fence, a sophisticated security fence with surveillance equipment, the kind of fence that a private climbing expedition should never encounter in a supposedly natural, unrestricted climbing area. When Robert realized what he'd stumbled upon, he made a critical decision. He didn't immediately descend and report it to authorities. He agreed to the redirection, at least outwardly, but his actual goal was to move his team away from the facility while maintaining radio silence so that their communications couldn't be intercepted. His plan, based on his journal, was to reach a location where they could safely access communications and report the discovery to the appropriate authorities. He was operating on the assumption that once his team was at a distance, once they were in contact with outside authorities, they would be protected by the institutional apparatus of government oversight and law. That assumption was tragically, fatally incorrect. What happened next, is where the investigation becomes even more disturbing. According to testimony from at least 2 people who were working at the facility at that time, testimony given years later to investigators in confidential settings that we only know about from leaked documents, a decision was made at a command level to contain the situation. The climbing team represented a security risk. They had seen the facility. They had seen Blackstone operatives. They had been intentionally deceived, which meant they would likely realize they'd been deceived. They would report it. And if they reported it, questions would be raised about what exactly Blackstone was doing in that region and whether the operation had proper legal authorization. That couldn't be allowed to happen. Personnel from the facility were mobilized. The climbing team was tracked. Robert Chen's decision to scatter, to have team members attempt to descend separately to avoid all of them being captured, might have seemed tactically sound, but it meant the team was divided and vulnerable. They didn't have safety in numbers. They had dispersal into terrain where Blackstone operatives could intercept them, one group at a time, or individually. The details of what happened over the next 12 hours are incomplete, but survivors' testimony and the physical evidence paint a horrifying picture. The climbers were restrained. They were taken to the facility. They were kept in a holding area while decision-makers figured out how to handle a crisis situation. The worst part is that there apparently was some internal debate about whether this situation could be managed differently. Some reports suggest that at least 1 or 2 people working for Blackstone questioned whether the planned course of action was appropriate, but they were overruled by command authority. The climbers were told they would be released after a debriefing. They were told they could be allowed to leave if they agreed to absolute confidentiality, if they agreed to never speak about what they'd seen. Some of the climbers apparently believed this, at least initially. They believed that the situation might end without fatal consequences. It didn't. Working from the whistleblower's information and the classified investigative files, federal authorities obtained judicial authorization to search specific areas of the region. In May 2015, excavation teams went to work at a remote location approximately 8 miles from where the tent had been discovered. What they found was a mass grave. 10 bodies, buried in a hastily prepared grave, covered with stone and soil, hidden in a ravine that wouldn't be discovered through normal park patrols. The bodies were those of Robert Chen, Maria Delgado, James Whitmore, Sarah Kim, Henrik Larson, David Okafor, Marcus Webb, Yuki Tanaka, Patricia Moreno, Alex Turner, and Thomas Bradley. Forensic analysis of the remains was consistent with a timeline that suggested they had been held for several days after being captured, then execution had taken place. The method and exact timing remain part of sealed investigative files, but the cause of death was determined to be homicide. The revelation that the climbers hadn't simply disappeared, that they hadn't been victims of some mountaineering accident, that they had been deliberately killed by security operatives, this sent shockwaves through the entire country. The families were notified first. Robert Chen's wife said, in a brief statement that came out the next day, "I'm not angry yet. I'm still trying to understand how this happened. But yes, I will be angry. This is murder, and the world needs to understand that." Patricia Moreno's daughter broke down when discussing her mother, saying, "She was just trying to climb a mountain. She was living her dream. And someone decided that was a threat." The story dominated global news coverage. How had this happened? How had a private security company been allowed to conduct classified operations in an area open to civilian access? How had 10 innocent people been killed? And most importantly, who gave the order? The government response was initially defensive. Agencies insisted they couldn't discuss classified operations. They said that security concerns prevented them from being fully transparent. But the public wasn't having it. The public was outraged. Pressure mounted from Congress, from civil rights organizations, from international observers. The story became an emblem of unchecked executive power and corporate military contractors operating without adequate oversight. Media investigations began uncovering the history of Blackstone's operations in the region. Journalists found documents showing that the facility had been authorized through what appeared to be highly irregular channels, contracts that seemed designed to avoid normal government review processes. A federal investigation was launched into Blackstone's operations. The company faced criminal charges related to the deaths of the climbers. Key executives were indicted. The company eventually paid a multi-billion-dollar settlement to the families of the victims, the largest settlement in a criminal case of its kind. The facility was dismantled. The operational authorization was revoked. The entire program was shut down. Congressional hearings were held, and testimony revealed a pattern of inadequate oversight, misuse of security classifications to hide operational mistakes, and what many observers characterized as a complete failure of the government's ability to supervise private security contractors. Several individuals who worked at the facility eventually came forward with their testimony. Most of them described a situation where they were following orders from superiors. They described an organizational culture where questioning those orders was not encouraged. They described genuinely believing at the time that their work was necessary for national security. But they also described a moment of reckoning when it became clear that orders had been given to handle the climber situation in a way that was criminal. Some of them said they expected to carry out those orders. Some of them actually did carry out those orders, and some of them refused and reported the situation through military channels, though those reports were apparently overlooked or suppressed until the external investigation was already underway. The execution of the climbers was eventually attributed to a direct order from a senior Blackstone commander, a man named Colonel James Hartley. Hartley claimed that he was operating under authorization from his government liaisons, that the decision to permanently silence the witnesses was not made unilaterally by the company. The government liaisons denied this, claiming they never authorized any such action. That contradiction was never definitively resolved in public court records. Hartley was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Other personnel involved in the actual execution received varying sentences. But the question of exactly how much authorization came from government versus how much was a unilateral company decision remains somewhat clouded. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't know about. Here's where the investigation reveals something that challenges our understanding of what happened and why. As federal investigators continued working the case, as they interviewed facility personnel and analyzed records, a different picture began to emerge. The facility wasn't conducting the kind of routine surveillance that people initially assumed. The technology being researched wasn't just advanced surveillance systems. The operation was actually much more extensive and sophisticated than anyone initially realized. Internal Blackstone documents revealed that the operation had been going on for nearly a decade before the climbers stumbled upon it. During that entire time, the location of the facility had been kept secret from the public and from most government agencies. Even people within the government didn't know exactly what was happening there, because the project had been compartmentalized to an extreme degree. The facility had been conducting what could be described as advanced research into biological and technological enhancement systems with significant military applications. The research had produced results that some in the military establishment considered breakthrough technology. It had also cost millions of dollars. There was genuine investment in this project, genuine belief that the work was important for national security. The problem was that the project existed in a legal gray area. It had never been subjected to the normal approval processes for classified military research. It had been funded through complicated accounting mechanisms that deliberately obscured the money trail. The facility operated with minimal oversight and absolutely minimal accountability. When the climbers discovered the facility, they didn't discover a simple surveillance operation. They discovered something much bigger. They discovered evidence that there were parts of the government apparatus operating outside normal channels, operating without the oversight that should have existed. And when you discover something like that, when you represent a threat to that kind of system, the people running that system respond according to their logic. Not the logic of law or justice or ethics, the logic of institutional survival. Investigators eventually concluded that the decision to eliminate the climbers wasn't made because the climbers knew about a facility. It was made because eliminating the climbers removed evidence of an illegal operation that went far beyond what even the government was willing to acknowledge publicly. In the years following the discoveries and the criminal trials, a lot has happened. The facility was completely shut down. The equipment was decommissioned. Some of it was transferred to other, supposedly more properly supervised locations. Some of it was destroyed. Blackstone Security Solutions still exists as a company, though it operates under much stricter government supervision now. Several of its major contracts were terminated. Its reputation was damaged profoundly. The families of the victims established a foundation dedicated to promoting transparency in government and proper oversight of private military contractors. They have donated the settlement money to researchers studying the history of the case and to legal organizations working to prevent similar abuses. But there are still unanswered questions. Important questions. First, exactly how much did senior government officials know about the operation before the climbers' deaths? The investigation found that at least some civilian government overseers had some knowledge of the facility's existence and the general nature of the work. But did they know specifically that Blackstone would be willing to commit mass murder to protect operational secrecy? That remains disputed. Second, what exactly was the facility researching? Even today, significant portions of the research remain classified. We know it involved advanced technology. We know it involved biological research. We know it was considered militarily significant, but the specific details remain locked away in classified files. Third, were there other incidents before the climbers? The investigation revealed that the facility had been operating for nearly a decade without oversight. Did other people, other hikers or explorers, accidentally encounter the facility in that time? Were there other people eliminated to maintain operational security? This was investigated but never definitively answered. Some classified reports suggest there may have been at least one other incident, but public confirmation was never provided. Fourth, who specifically decided that the climbers needed to be permanently silenced? This is perhaps the most important question. If it was a unilateral Blackstone decision, then it's a criminal act by a company operating outside government sanction. If it was a government decision, it's a much more serious scandal. It represents the government deliberately choosing to commit mass murder to cover up an operation. The truth appears to fall somewhere in the middle, but the exact placement of responsibility has been obscured by legal procedures and classified information restrictions. What people often forget when discussing this case is the human element. These were people, real people with lives and families and futures that were stolen. Robert Chen's wife eventually remarried years later. She said in an interview that this wasn't a betrayal of Robert's memory, but rather what she believed Robert would have wanted, for her to find happiness and not let grief consume her entire life. She still speaks at conferences about the need for government oversight and transparency. Maria Delgado's children grew up without her. Her daughter completed medical school and specializes in high-altitude medicine research. She carries on her mother's legacy in her own way. James Whitmore's documentary footage from the expedition, the footage he'd shot before the deviation, was eventually recovered from base camp records and released publicly. His final work, the last images he captured before he died, become a haunting record of what appears to be a team that sensed something was wrong. In the footage from their last few days, body language changes. People become more cautious. The tone becomes more serious. Whitmore captures it all on film without apparently realizing he's documenting his team's final days alive. Patricia Moreno's book about mountaineering was published posthumously. In it, she describes the philosophy of climbing, the relationship between humans and mountains, and the importance of respect for forces larger than ourselves. The irony is devastating. She was killed not by the mountain she had learned to respect, but by human beings she had no reason to expect would betray her. Alex Turner would have turned 50 years old last year if he had lived. His mother established a scholarship in his name for young mountaineers from disadvantaged backgrounds. She talks about how Alex never lost his sense of wonder about the mountains, even as he became more experienced and technically skilled. She says his death feels like the world lost someone important, someone who embodied the best aspects of human aspiration and physical capability. The case of the Apex climbing expedition and the Blackstone facility represents something larger than just a single incident of corporate criminal activity. It represents a failure of systemic oversight. It represents a gap in government accountability that allowed people to operate essentially unmonitored for nearly a decade. Subsequent investigations revealed that Blackstone wasn't unique in having this kind of operational freedom. There were multiple private security contractors operating in classified or semi-classified capacities with minimal external oversight. The mechanisms that should have prevented such operations from occurring without proper authorization had broken down or been deliberately bypassed. Legislative reforms were eventually passed in response to the scandal. New oversight mechanisms were established for private contractors working on government projects. Funding for such operations became subject to more rigorous review processes. Congressional committees were given greater authority to investigate classified operations conducted by private contractors. Whether these reforms go far enough is still debated. Critics argue that classified operations remain too opaque, that the reforms merely create the appearance of oversight without actually providing the kind of transparency that would prevent future abuses. Others argue that some degree of operational security is necessary and that excessive transparency could compromise legitimate national security efforts. The truth probably exists in the middle, as truth often does. Legitimate security needs exist, but those needs can't justify mass murder or the elimination of witnesses to cover up operations. There has to be a balance, and finding that balance is something democratic societies will continue to struggle with. One thing many people find strange about this case is how the investigation ever moved forward at all. If Blackstone was willing to commit mass murder to protect the facility's existence, why did they leave Robert Chen's journal at the campsite? Why didn't they eliminate that evidence? The answer comes down to the rushed nature of the situation and the geography of the terrain. When Robert Chen made the decision to scatter, to have his team members try to escape separately, he was trying to give them the best chance of survival. One group, including Robert, managed to reach the tent location, the location where they'd temporarily established a camp during their attempted escape, before being intercepted by Blackstone personnel. Robert, realizing what was about to happen, made a final desperate decision. He hid the journal. He placed it in a location where he hoped it might be found, where it might serve as evidence of what had occurred. He did this knowing he was about to be captured, knowing it was unlikely he would survive. We know this because the journal, when analyzed, showed physical evidence of being deliberately hidden and deliberately concealed. It had been wrapped in protective material and placed in a crevice that would be difficult to find unless you were specifically looking for it. The protective wrapping prevented it from being completely destroyed by 17 months of exposure to the elements. Robert Chen's final act was to try to leave evidence, to try to ensure that what happened to him and his team wouldn't simply disappear into mystery and classified files. He couldn't have known whether anyone would ever find it. But he tried. The journal was found because of chance. David Morrison, the park ranger who discovered the tent, was thorough in his examination of the site. He noticed the crevice. He noticed something that didn't quite match the natural contours of the rock. He found the journal. That journal became the key evidence that broke open the case. Without it, the story might have remained a mystery. The tent alone wasn't definitive proof of what happened. But Robert Chen's own words, his documentation of the sequence of events, changed everything. So what is the final truth of this case? What should we understand about what happened to the Apex climbing expedition? The truth is that 10 skilled, accomplished, intelligent people made a terrible mistake. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They discovered something they weren't supposed to discover. And when they did, they were killed by people who had decided that operational security was more important than human life. The truth is that those responsible faced justice, at least to some degree. They were investigated, prosecuted, and convicted. Blackstone faced criminal charges and paid massive settlements. The operation was shut down. Congressional oversight was improved. But the truth is also that questions remain. Questions about who authorized what, about how much senior government officials knew, about what other incidents might have occurred under the cover of operational security. The truth is that this represents both a tragedy and a moment of reckoning for government and private security contractor oversight. The case forced a conversation that needed to happen. It forced examination of systems that had been operating with insufficient accountability. Most importantly, the truth is that 10 people who were simply trying to climb a mountain became victims of a system that failed them. They became victims of institutional arrogance and the belief that operational security justifies any action necessary to maintain it. Robert Chen's final journal entry haunts everyone who reads it. They've found us. 2 hours, maybe less. I've told the team to scatter, take the emergency supplies, try to reach base camp separately. If we disperse, maybe not all of them will be caught. This is my fault. This is all my fault. Robert was wrong about one thing. It wasn't his fault. He was following the mountains and the laws of physics and the universe as he understood them. The fault lay with a system that would choose to commit murder rather than face accountability. And his decision to scatter, his decision to try to save at least some members of his team, was ultimately what allowed him to make a final desperate attempt to leave evidence. His last journal entry was his last gift to his team and their families, a record that would ensure their story wouldn't be erased, that the truth would eventually emerge. That tent, found 17 months after it was abandoned, containing blood and equipment and devastation, that tent became a turning point. What was found there changed everything. It changed how we understand government oversight, private military contractors, and the lengths to which institutions will go to protect themselves. The mountain that Robert Chen had spent his life respecting, that he had always described as an entity worthy of humility and caution, ultimately wasn't the force that ended his life. It was human beings. It was institutional systems. It was a failure of the mechanisms that should have prevented precisely this kind of tragedy. The Apex climbing expedition didn't die on Mount Challenger. They died in a grave 8 miles away, killed by people they had never harmed, whose secret they had accidentally discovered. Their story serves as a permanent record of what can happen when oversight fails and when institutional survival matters more than human life. Years after the trials concluded and the criminal sentences were handed down, redacted versions of investigative documents began to emerge through Freedom of Information Act requests and authorized declassification. What these documents revealed added crucial context to the case and raised new questions about the decision-making process that led to the climbers' deaths. One particularly significant document was an internal Blackstone memo dated October 10, 2013, the day after Robert Chen made his first entry about the fence. The memo was addressed to Facility Command and outlined several options for dealing with what was described as the civilian intrusion situation. The language was deliberately obscure, using bureaucratic phrasing to discuss what amounted to life and death decisions about 10 human beings. The first option outlined was immediate dispersal, which meant allowing the climbers to leave and ascend Mount Challenger with personnel monitoring to ensure they didn't actually reach any part of the facility. This option was rejected because, according to the memo, the climbers had already been exposed to sensitive visual evidence and would likely become curious or suspicious upon reflection. The second option was temporary detainment and briefing, essentially holding the climbers for a period of time while explaining that they had stumbled into a sensitive military zone and requesting their cooperation in maintaining secrecy. This option was labeled as high risk due to information retention probability. In other words, they didn't believe the climbers would keep quiet, no matter what they were told. The third option was described only obliquely in the redacted version, but the implication was clear: permanent elimination of the potential security threat. The memo concluded with a recommendation for consultative guidance from governmental liaisons before proceeding with higher risk options. In plain language, this meant Blackstone was asking the government officials who oversaw the operation whether they should go ahead with killing the climbers. This memo was absolutely crucial to understanding the case because it proved that Blackstone didn't act unilaterally in a moment of panic. There was a decision-making process, there was consultation, there was time for someone to say no. The response memo came back 2 days later, on October 12th. It was addressed to Colonel James Hartley and signed only with initials that were redacted in the released version. The memo was brief, just a few paragraphs, and its language was surprisingly direct for a classified government communication. The continued security of the facility and associated research cannot be compromised. Take whatever measures are necessary to ensure continued operational security. You have authorization to proceed with all available options. Report completion status upon conclusion. That memo became crucial evidence in the criminal trial. It represented the clearest possible evidence that a government official, an official whose identity was never definitively revealed to the public, though investigative journalists made educated guesses, had authorized the elimination of the climbing team. Hartley's defense team argued that the memo was ambiguous, that whatever measures are necessary could be interpreted in various ways, and that Hartley had reasonably understood this to mean he had authority to detain the climbers, not kill them. But the prosecution argued, and the jury agreed, that in context, given the earlier memos discussing options, whatever measures are necessary clearly contemplated the most extreme option. The question of who signed that authorization memo was never publicly established with certainty. The individual was identified only through initials in the released documents. Multiple journalists attempted to match the handwriting and analyze the writing style to identify the signer. Several names were proposed, and there was intense speculation in media and academic circles. What eventually became clear, from interviews with former government officials and authorized leaks to journalists, was that the official in question was no longer in government service. The person had either retired or taken a position in the private sector. And there was apparently a deliberate decision by the government not to prosecute this individual. Why? The most likely explanation, according to observers and legal analysts, was that prosecuting the official would require too much disclosure of what the facility was actually researching and why it was considered important enough to authorize mass murder to protect. The government decided it was preferable to prosecute Blackstone and individual company employees rather than to expose the full scope of what had been happening at the facility. This became a major point of controversy. Victim advocacy groups argued that justice was incomplete. If a government official had authorized the killings, shouldn't they be held accountable in court? The government's response was essentially that national security concerns prevented such prosecution from occurring. The anonymous whistleblower who had initially come forward with information about Blackstone's operations eventually agreed to do a more detailed interview with investigative journalists, though their identity was never publicly revealed. In this extended interview, the whistleblower provided context that was deeply disturbing. According to the whistleblower, the Blackstone facility was one of at least 5 similar operations running in remote regions with minimal oversight. The organization had essentially created its own archipelago of classified research facilities that operated according to their own rules and with minimal external accountability. Some of these facilities conducted research that was too sensitive or too ethically questionable to conduct within the formal military research establishment. The whistleblower described a culture within Blackstone where following orders was absolute. Questions were not encouraged. The hierarchy was military style, and the organization operated with a conviction that what they were doing was necessary for national defense, even when what they were doing involved things that would horrify the general public if it became known. "I was there for 3 years," the whistleblower said. "I was a researcher. I didn't carry a weapon. I didn't make tactical decisions, but I was part of the system. I was contributing to something I didn't fully understand, and I convinced myself that if it was classified and authorized, then it must be important and justified." The whistleblower described becoming uncomfortable with aspects of the operation. There were discussions among staff about what would happen if an unauthorized person discovered the facility. The contingency plans were discussed in sanitized language during official briefings, but the whistleblower said it was clear to anyone paying attention what those contingencies actually meant. "When the climbers showed up, I didn't know what was going to happen," the whistleblower said. "I knew they were a problem for operational security. I knew there were protocols, but I genuinely didn't think the organization would go as far as they actually went. I was naive. I was complicit in a system that I didn't fully understand, and when the limits of that system became visible, I was horrified." The whistleblower eventually contacted federal investigators and provided detailed testimony about Blackstone's internal decision-making processes, about the culture of the organization, and about specific communications between company leadership and government liaisons. This testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. After the trials concluded, the whistleblower was given a settlement by the government as compensation for the risks associated with coming forward. The amount was never publicly disclosed, but multiple sources indicated it was substantial. The whistleblower has not made any public statements since the trials concluded. There is no way of knowing what they're doing now or where they are. Despite the trials, despite the convictions, despite the government accountability measures that were implemented, there remained unexplained inconsistencies in the official narrative. For instance, multiple witnesses at the Blackstone facility testified about a moment when someone questioned the decision to proceed with permanent termination of the witnesses. One witness, a military liaison officer named Captain Sarah Wells, testified that she explicitly stated her objection to the plan and refused to participate in its execution. Wells claimed that when she objected, she was told to stand down and not to discuss her objections with anyone. She was reassigned away from the facility shortly after the incident. When she was interviewed by federal investigators years later, she had to consult with legal counsel before giving her testimony because she was concerned about violating classified information agreements. Wells' testimony raised an important question. If she objected, and if her objection was documented in any way, why wasn't that enough to stop the operation? Why didn't her refusal to participate create enough friction in the decision-making process to allow alternatives to be considered? The prosecution argued that Wells's objection, while admirable, was not in a position of authority sufficient to override the direct authorization from higher-level officials. The implication was that the decision had already been made at levels above the facility. By the time the objection came, it was too late to change course. But many observers found this troubling. It suggested a system where once a decision was made at high levels, it became essentially unstoppable, regardless of objections from people on the ground who might have better information about the situation. Another unexplained inconsistency involved the timeline. Robert Chen's journal suggested the climbers were captured on October 12th, but the forensic analysis of the remains suggested that death had occurred at least 2 or 3 days after capture, possibly longer. Where were the climbers being held? What was happening during those days between capture and execution? Why the delay? Some investigators theorized that there was internal debate among Blackstone Command about whether the planned course of action was actually necessary. Perhaps some officials were reconsidering or exploring whether there might be alternative ways to handle the situation. The delay might represent a period where different factions within the organization were arguing about the best course of action. But this remained speculation. The surviving participants in those command-level discussions either refused to discuss what was said or claimed not to remember specific conversations. The written communications from that period were either destroyed or remained classified. The criminal justice system provided some accountability, but for the families of the victims, the process was incomplete in ways that are hard to fully articulate. Elizabeth Chen, Robert Chen's widow, has become something of a public figure in discussions about government accountability and oversight reform. She appears at conferences and gives testimony to legislative committees. But in interviews about her personal experience, she talks about the difficulty of moving forward when crucial questions remain unanswered. "I know who killed my husband," she said in one interview. "I know their names. I watched them be convicted and sentenced. But I don't know why the government allowed it to happen. I don't know whether someone in government gave the direct order or simply allowed the company to act without oversight. That distinction matters to me. That distinction defines the nature of the injustice my husband suffered." The families pursued additional civil litigation beyond the criminal trials. They sued Blackstone, federal agencies, and sought damages from the government contractors involved. Some of these cases settled, some are still ongoing. The emotional toll of the continuing litigation on the families is difficult to overstate. Some family members have spoken about what they call the perpetual investigation syndrome, the way that discovering truth about a tragedy can sometimes feel worse than the initial grief of not knowing. When you don't know what happened, you can imagine various scenarios. Some might be worse than the actual truth, but some might be more comforting. Once you know, that ambiguity is gone. You're left with the specific, documented, unavoidable reality. When my father was missing, I held on to hope that maybe he was alive somewhere, said Sarah Chen, Robert's daughter. I know that's irrational, but hope isn't rational. Finding the tent didn't give me closure. Finding the grave didn't give me closure. Learning how he died didn't give me closure. What it gave me was a permanent, unchangeable knowledge that he was murdered, that he was killed deliberately, and that some of the people responsible for that decision are living their lives outside of prison right now. Sarah's last comment refers to the fact that while Colonel James Hartley and several Blackstone personnel were convicted and received prison sentences, many other people involved in the decision-making process were never prosecuted. The government official who authorized the operation was never publicly identified or charged. Several Blackstone executives who made strategic decisions were never charged because those decisions, while morally reprehensible, were technically made before the organization had decided to proceed with the extreme option. Nearly 12 years have passed since the grave was discovered. The immediate crisis has passed. The trials are over. The facility is shut down. The government has implemented new oversight mechanisms. But the families and observers of the case argue that the justice process remains incomplete. Several key questions have never been answered in any official proceeding. First, the exact nature of the research being conducted at the facility. Even today, 12 years later, the specific research that was being conducted remains heavily classified. We know it involved biological and technological enhancement systems with military applications. We know it produced research that some considered breakthrough technology. But the actual details remain locked away. Why does this matter? Because it's impossible to fully evaluate whether the decision to eliminate witnesses was justified without knowing what exactly was being protected. Were they protecting research that was truly critical to national security? Or were they protecting research that was ethically questionable or legally problematic? The public has no way of knowing because the research remains classified. Second, whether there were other similar incidents at other Blackstone facilities or at other private security contractor operations. The investigation revealed that Blackstone wasn't unique in having this kind of operational freedom. But comprehensive audits of other operations were never conducted, at least not publicly. It's possible that the climbing expedition wasn't an anomaly, but rather just the one incident that was discovered. Third, the specific identity and role of the government official who authorized the operation. While everyone accepts that prosecution of this individual likely won't happen, the public also has the right to know who made this decision. It has the right to know whether this official was ever held accountable in any way, whether they ever faced consequences, or whether they simply moved on to a comfortable retirement or a position in the private sector. Fourth, and perhaps most fundamentally, the mechanisms that allowed such a situation to develop in the first place. How did a private security company come to be operating essentially unsupervised for nearly a decade? What specific policy decisions and oversight failures allowed this to happen? And most importantly, what specific mechanisms are now in place to ensure it doesn't happen again? The government has made statements about implementing new oversight, but the details remain obscure. The case of the Apex climbing expedition has become a teaching example in discussions about government accountability, private military contractors, and the balance between security and oversight. It's taught in law schools as a case study in criminal responsibility and organizational liability. It's discussed in international forums about private security contractors and human rights. But the most important lesson the case teaches is perhaps the simplest one. Institutions prioritize their own survival over everything else, including human life, when left without adequate external accountability and oversight. This isn't a problem unique to military or security contexts. It's a fundamental aspect of how large organizations function. The way to prevent such tragedies is not to assume that people within organizations will self-correct or that internal ethics will prevent wrongdoing. The way to prevent it is through external oversight, transparency, accountability mechanisms, and the willingness to prosecute people in power when they violate the law. The case also demonstrates that determined individuals and small groups can sometimes overcome organizational power and institutional secrecy. Robert Chen's decision to hide his journal, the park ranger's decision to investigate what he found carefully, The whistleblower's decision to come forward, the investigative journalist's refusal to accept official statements at face value, all of these individual actions eventually forced a reckoning with institutional power. But the case also demonstrates that such victory is incomplete and partial. Justice was not fully served. The full truth was not revealed. Some people responsible were not held accountable. Some research remains hidden. Some questions remain unanswered. Each year, on October 2nd, the families of the Apex climbing expedition gather to remember the victims and to reflect on what their deaths have meant for policy and accountability discussions. In 2024, the 11th anniversary of the initial expedition, the families held a memorial service at the base of Mount Challenger. Members of the government, congressional representatives, and journalists attended. There was a moment of silence. Flowers were placed, statements were read about the individuals who had died and what each of them had contributed to the world. Robert Chen's daughter spoke about her father's philosophy of respect and humility in the face of natural forces. Maria Delgado's son spoke about his mother's dedication to medicine and to saving lives in extreme environments. Patricia Moreno's daughter read passages from her mother's book about mountaineering and the human spirit. But alongside the remembrance came renewed calls for answers. Victim advocacy groups distributed materials asking for the identity of the government official who authorized the operation to be released. They called for comprehensive public audits of other private security contractor operations. They called for stronger legal mechanisms to hold government and corporate leaders accountable. Whether these calls will result in any additional action remains to be seen. The political will to reopen investigations into classified operations is limited. The government's tendency is toward protecting operational security and institutional reputation. But the families and their advocates continue to push for greater transparency and accountability. Beyond the policy implications and the institutional lessons, what endures are the human stories. What endures is the memory of 10 accomplished, extraordinary human beings who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and paid the ultimate price for a discovery they made. Robert Chen's legacy is that of a man who faced an impossible situation and tried to do the right thing. He didn't immediately panic or act selfishly. He tried to protect his team. He tried to gather information. He tried to make decisions based on principle rather than fear. And when he realized the magnitude of the threat, he took the final step of leaving behind evidence that would eventually expose what happened. Maria Delgado's legacy is that of a healer who dedicated her life to understanding and treating the human body in extreme conditions. Her research was contributing to knowledge that could save lives in situations where medical help is unavailable. Patricia Moreno's legacy is that of someone who never stopped pursuing what fascinated and inspired her. She was still climbing mountains in her 50s because she loved the mountains and everything they represented about human capability and the vastness of the natural world. These are not abstract stories or policy discussions. These are people. And what happened to them was a tragedy that could have been prevented if systems of accountability had functioned properly. No major event in recent history goes without generating its share of conspiracy theories and alternative narratives. The Apex climbing expedition case is no exception. Some theories suggest that the facility was conducting more extreme research than has ever been publicly revealed. They suggest that it was involved in genetic modification or bioweapon development. The lack of detailed public information about the research feeds these theories because people's imaginations tend to fill in the blanks with the most extreme possibilities. Other theories suggest that the government was more deeply involved in the decision-making process than official narratives acknowledge. Some claim that the decision came from much higher levels than the government official, whose identity was never publicly revealed. Some suggest the involvement of intelligence agencies that have remained completely silent throughout the investigation. Still, other theories suggest that not all 10 climbers actually died. Some online communities maintain elaborate theories about climbers going into witness protection or having been recruited into the very facility they stumbled upon. None of these theories are supported by the actual evidence. The investigations were conducted by multiple agencies and multiple levels of law enforcement. The trials involved both prosecution and defense teams with resources to challenge false narratives. The evidence was examined by independent forensic experts. The physical remains were identified through DNA analysis. The official narrative, while incomplete in many ways, is supported by substantial evidence. But the proliferation of conspiracy theories points to something important: the public's hunger for complete truth. When official narratives contain gaps and when classified information prevents full transparency, people will imagine explanations to fill those gaps. The conspiracy theories are in some ways a symptom of legitimate concerns about government transparency and the public's right to know. 12 years after the grave was discovered, the case remains relevant for several reasons. First, because the underlying issues haven't been resolved. Private security contractors still operate with significant autonomy. Government oversight of classified operations, while theoretically improved, remains limited. The mechanisms for ensuring accountability are better than they were before, but they're still imperfect. Second, because the case is studied in ethics and law courses around the world. New generations of lawyers, policymakers, and government officials learn about the Apex climbing expedition and consider what they would have done in similar circumstances. Would they have followed orders? Would they have objected? Would they have come forward? Third, because the families have continued to fight for answers and accountability in ways that have become an ongoing inspiration to others advocating for transparency in government. Elizabeth Chen has written a book about her experience navigating the aftermath of her husband's death and the ongoing fight for accountability. Other family members have become involved in advocacy organizations and policy discussions. Fourth, because the case demonstrates that the truth, while it can be suppressed and delayed, tends eventually to emerge. Robert Chen's decision to hide his journal, made in what he probably thought were his final moments, resulted in evidence that took nearly 2 years to discover, but eventually forced a complete reckoning with what had happened. If you had to identify a single question that matters most in this case, a question whose answer would fundamentally change how we understand what happened, it would be this: did the government official who authorized the operation genuinely believe that eliminating the climbers was necessary for national security? Or did they authorize it knowing it was wrong, simply because they prioritized institutional protection over human life? The answer to this question matters because it determines whether we're discussing a tragic misjudgment by someone who thought they were protecting the country or a calculated decision to commit murder for institutional reasons. And here's the problem: we'll probably never definitively know the answer. The official in question was never publicly identified. If they're still alive, they're not talking. Their journals, if they kept any, haven't been revealed. The government won't release the internal communications that would answer this question because doing so would require revealing too much about the classified research. So we're left with uncertainty, with incomplete justice, with questions that will likely never be fully answered. And that uncertainty is perhaps the most important lesson of all. It demonstrates why transparency and external oversight matter so much. When decisions are made in classified, unsupervised contexts, accountability becomes nearly impossible. The institutions involved can control the narrative, can limit what information becomes public, can protect their own officials while allowing subordinates to face consequences. The families of the Apex climbing expedition will never have complete justice. They will never have complete truth. But their struggle to achieve whatever justice and truth could be extracted from the system has benefited everyone. It has demonstrated that even powerful institutions can be held accountable if people are willing to fight for that accountability. The 10 climbers of the Apex climbing expedition died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But their deaths mattered. Their deaths forced a reckoning with institutional accountability that had been avoided for too long. Their deaths led to policy changes that have made it slightly more difficult for similar tragedies to occur. They didn't die for nothing. They died for something that ultimately served the broader society, even though that's cold comfort to their families. Robert Chen's final journal entry: "They've found us. 2 hours, maybe less. I've told the team to scatter. Take the emergency supplies. Try to reach base camp separately. If we disperse, maybe not all of them will be caught. This is my fault. This is all my fault." captures the essential tragedy of the situation. A skilled, experienced, prepared mountaineer facing a threat he never could have anticipated, trying to protect his team in the only way he could, accepting blame for circumstances entirely beyond his control. His decision to hide that journal, made with no certainty that anyone would ever find it, made with almost no hope that it would matter, ultimately changed everything. That's the final truth of the apex climbing expedition. Sometimes the smallest, most desperate actions, the hidden journal, the careful examination by a park ranger, the decision to come forward by a whistleblower, can eventually overcome institutional power and force truth and accountability into the light.